Hello and welcome to this episode from Range Woodworking. Today I'll make this beautiful keepsake box with a grain match around all four corners and an eye-catching shadow line around the base. Firstly, I'll fish this board of white oak out, and for some reason that I can't quite comprehend, I'll cut it down to smaller boards using this hand saw. I'm all for using hand tools, but I can feel myself aging, I think. Maybe I should look at rearranging my workshop and building a miter station. Let me know below in the comments if that's the sort of thing you'd like to see. Now, eventually I cut this piece off and it will form the walls of the box. And this is all I'll cut for now because I haven't quite decided how I'm going to do the base or the lid. I'll flatten a face and an edge on the jointer before the first of approximately 20 blade changes for this project. I'll swap out the cross-cutting blade for my ripping blade to resaw this board down the middle. This is step 1 of the 4-corner grain match. Now, firstly, I will say that resawing boards on the table saw isn't great for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's a bit sketchy in general and things tend to pucker. Secondly, there's a lot more wastage than using a bandsaw for resawing. Thirdly, it takes a lot longer because you should do it in multiple passes and keep the same face against the fence, just like this. I'll run the two pieces through the thicknesser, and then you can see how the grain continues along the board. As you can see here, when the ends of the boards follow through, the grain matches, which lets it flow through all four sides. Just make sure that you keep all your pieces in order. Off camera, the blade has changed back to my crosscut blade to cut the miters for the corners of the box. Now I'll set the blade to 45 degrees-ish, and I'm not too fussed about the angle because I'm going to try something where I cut one side of the miter with the piece passing below the blade and the other above the blade. The way I see it is that if the 45 is slightly off and it gets cut normally, you'd end up with gappy miters. And no one likes gappy miters. But this method means that if the angle is out, the amount it's out is reversed on the mating piece. It's the same logic as most picture frame sleds, mine included. I'll link that video below. It does, however, require a bit of mental gymnastics to plan your cuts, and I highly recommend the dimensions of your box being somewhat flexible for adjustments. Again, I really don't know if this is a thing or if I just made my life more complicated for absolutely no reason. But I'll probably do this in a few more projects and see if it makes any difference or not. Now, the tape method is probably the simplest / cheapest / most foolproof method for gluing up miters. We are a long way off gluing at the moment, but the tape will let me dry assemble it a number of times to check those miters, which look pretty good. I've decided I'm going to use these other pieces of oak for the base panel. I'm going to use my latest flavour of the month glue, Tight Bond polyurethane, and my usual excess of clamps to put this panel together. With a hint of dodgy editing, the glue is cured and the clamps are removed, and we get to my favourite feature of this glue. That magical, crispy foam scraping. I'm going to shut up and just let you turn the volume up for a minute. A quick tidy up and it's time to turn this base into a feature. I'm going to use the base to elevate the rest of the box by a couple of millimeters, establishing a shadow line around the bottom of the box. To save me doing any more maths, I position the base panel and overhang it by a couple of mil, and then measure to see where the base will sit. Once more, I'll change the blade out, this time for a 1/4" dado stack. And then I'll set the fence to the same measurement as I recorded before. I'll aim to cut the rabbet about halfway through and then cut the channels in all of the pieces. I'm really enjoying all of the new avenues a dado capable saw brings to my process. Even if the dado stack still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. To measure for the panel, I use these 2 skewers, pushed into the depths of the rabbet and taped together. Upon reflection, using something a bit less flexible would probably be a better option. It was hit and miss. Once I had my measurements, I changed the blade again and cut the panel to size before measuring the accurate depth of my rabbets using a combination square. I'll then transfer that measurement to a marking gauge and then use the marking gauge to transfer that to the panel. Again, upon reflection, that seems excessive. Again, another blade change to install the dado stack again, this time with a sacrificial fence. I'll run the panel over the dado stack until I've removed material right up to that line I scribed before. After those crosscuts, I figured I should be safe and use the paddle that I've had within arm's reach the entire time, because running a 1/4" rabbet through the palm of my dominant hand just doesn't seem like a great idea. Now I can bring the pieces around the base panel using the tape, check everything fits well and see how that shadow line looks. And I'm really happy with that. Now after all of that excitement of the shadow line, I'm going to have to bring you back down to earth with some sanding. I'm going to sand the inside of the box because it will be easier to apply finish to the insides before it's all glued up. And whilst sanding isn't particularly interesting, I can promise an interesting sanding development later in the video, so strap yourself in. Some hand sanding of the bottom edge will bring this round of sanding hopefully to a close, and I'll begin taping all of the glue faces just to keep finish off them. When that's all finished, it's time to apply the finish on a little piece of scrap for elevation. And the finish I'll use today is Whittle Wax's Evolution Hard Wax Oil in matte. As usual, I will rub in a small amount of the finish with a white Scotch-Brite pad, let it soak in for 10 to 15 minutes, with an occasional re-rubbing in that time. And then I'll wipe away any excess with a paper shop cloth. The next day, the finish has dried, I can remove all of the tape and apparently come to my senses about what lid I want on this box. In essence, I'm going to do exactly the same as the base. So the dado stack goes back in, the depth is set, and the rabbet is cut. Taking a minute to make sure the correct edge is against the fence for each cut. Now, I like to think I learn my lessons, and I learn my lessons quite quickly. Having learned my lesson from the handsaw, I decided to whip out the jigsaw to cut these pieces for the lid. However, something isn't happy somewhere, and I've got a bunch of smoke, and in a second you'll see some very burned end grain. Look at that! It turns out this jigsaw blade was bent, and it was always destined to be a disaster. I'm sure by now you can guess the off-camera process I went through to make this panel, that I will now cut to exactly the same dimensions as the base. And usually I would use that kind of statement as foreshadowing for something bad happening down the line, but in this case it actually just worked. I'll cut the panel to size before reinstalling that dado stack to cut away at the lid panel. And if you're frustrated by all the blade changes, I am too. Let this be a sterling example of why you should have a plan before getting stuck into a project instead of being on team wing it. Now, after I re-dry fit it all together, you can see that the recess on the lid is a little bit bigger than the base, and it offers another interesting little feature. Almost like a little shadow line. Now, I'll add another feature to that feature using my tenoning jig. By tilting the blade to 10 degrees or so, I can cut a bevel into the lid and keep all of my fingers at the same time. Although I apparently have to use those fingers for some more hand sanding and then applying finish. Once the finish is all dry, it's time to fire up the laser for some personalization on the lid. And with my sweet protective lenses on and a good old nod of approval, I can fire it up. And when that's all lasered, I can finally look at gluing this whole thing together. Now I'll tape the inside of the joins to help catch any squeeze out, because with the base and the lid glued in place, I obviously won't be able to wipe away any excess glue whilst it's still wet. Once the tape is broadly on, I will give it my best surgeon skills to scalpel away the tape from the rabbets, and I'm not gonna lie, a good sharp knife made this super satisfying. To glue this up, I'm just using a sparing amount of Titebond Original before wrapping the whole thing up and using some more tape to bring it all together. I'll support the tape and squeeze those miters shut using these recently acquired band clamps, and then I'll quickly check for square. Now I'm going to build a little add-on for my tenoning jig. You might have seen me make a spline jig in my floating frame video, but I decided I'd try something a bit different. So I've taken a piece of MDF and trimmed it down to pretty much match the face of my tenoning jig. Then I'll clamp it against the jig fence and screw in a registration piece on the back. I'll use some super glue on a scrap piece of plywood and a combination square to make sure that I'm at 45 degrees. I'll use the square to line up the second piece and then a framing square just to double check that a piece won't touch the tabletop when it's getting its splines cut.
The next morning.
Once the glue is all dry, I can remove the band clamps and arduously wind up the super long straps and head over to the new spline jig. And you know what? I just can't quite bring myself to cut splines into it. I know, you'll say the joints aren't as strong, and they won't be, but it's a box. Firstly, it's reinforced by the lid and the base, which will limit diagonal compression that would break the joints. And secondly, it's a box. It's going to spend its whole life looking good on a shelf or something. Now that I've come to that challenging decision, I can bring you the exciting sanding reveal I mentioned earlier. Check out this awesome little Bosch quarter sheet palm sander. I wanted something a bit more wieldable for finish sanding and not risk gouging the piece with the heavy 6-inch sander. And I'll tell you what, it does a wicked job. However, I might need to look at mesh sandpaper options or something, just so I've got some dust extraction. Now, I'll measure my box, mentally work out where the lid comes down to, and then set my fence. And then, the bit that I always hate, as you can tell by my face, I have to cut all my hard work in half at the table saw. Well, not in half, 2 pieces. But you know what I mean. I'll cut the narrow sides of the box first and then the long edges, and it actually all went fine, but I still hate it. Here I've stuck some sheets of sanding paper to a flat piece of stone, and then I'll sand the lid and the box to give them both a perfect flat edge. Consider yourselves lucky that you don't have to hear the sound of the box on the sandpaper. Oh, never mind. I guess consider yourselves lucky that you don't have to hear the sound of the box on the paper for long. I'll quickly remove the tape from the inside of the box and then break all the edges with some sandpaper before blowing all the dust out of the grain with some compressed air. And look, we're nearly done now. I'll apply finish to the outside of the box and just leave it to cure. The final step is the hardware. So the next day I'll clamp the lid to the main box, making sure that everything is perfectly aligned. I'll then put a tiny piece of double-sided tape on the hinges and use a combination square to lay them out. Nervously, I'll chuck up my tiny little 1mm drill bit in the drill and drill some pilot holes. Honestly, it feels like a good gust of wind could kill this drill bit, so I'm being super careful and also being mindful not to send it through the inside face of the box. That would be annoying. Again, not foreshadowing, sorry. To put the nails in, I've found the best trick is to hold the nail in place with some needle nose pliers and then use a small, delicate hammer to knock them in. Failing that, use a framing hammer and make a mental note to buy a small, delicate hammer. Now, I did find the walls of the box were flexing a bit, which limited how well the nails went in, even with the framing hammer, but when I moved the box onto my vise, they went in fine. I'll clamp the lid back in place and then fix that half of the hinge in too. And the final stage is installing the catch on the front. Actually, I think it's called a hasp and staple or something, but we'll call it a catch. And with that, I'm finished. Here you can see how the grain matches at each corner all the way around. And thanks for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please consider liking and/or subscribing. And until next time, take it easy.